February 14, 1945. A remote prisoner of war camp in northern Ontario, Canada. When the mess hall doors swung open that morning and the aroma of slow-cooked venison stew drifted across the frozen compound, something unprecedented happened among the German women prisoners. Several of them stopped mid-step, their rigid military bearing faltering for the first time in months. One woman, 24-year-old Irmgard from a small village outside Munich, actually gasped aloud, her hand flying to her mouth as tears immediately sprang to her eyes. The scent carried with it something more powerful than mere hunger. It carried memory, identity, and a connection to a world these women thought they had lost forever. What could possibly make hardened prisoners of war, women who had maintained their dignity and defiance through months of captivity, break down at the smell of a simple stew? Before we discover what happened in that Canadian camp, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The story of that transformative meal actually begins 3 months earlier, but to truly understand its impact, we must first travel back even further, to the forests of Bavaria in November 1942. Irmgard Kohler had been 17 years old, standing beside her father and 2 older brothers in the misty morning woods outside their village. The annual deer hunt was a tradition in their family stretching back generations, a ritual that marked the turning of seasons and the approach of winter. Her father, Heinrich, had taught her to track, to read the forest signs, to wait with the patience that separated true hunters from mere shooters. She remembered the weight of the rifle in her hands, the way her breath formed clouds in the cold air, the absolute silence of the forest interrupted only by the distant call of a crow. When the buck finally appeared, moving through the underbrush with careful grace, her father had placed his hand gently on her shoulder. The shot, when it came, was clean and true. That evening, the entire village had gathered for the feast. Her mother, Gertrude, had prepared the venison in the traditional Bavarian style, slow-cooked with juniper berries, red wine, root vegetables, and herbs from their garden. The meat had been tender, rich with the flavor of the wild places, seasoned with pride and family tradition. Irmgard had sat at the long wooden table surrounded by everyone she loved, everyone who formed the boundaries of her world. Her grandfather had raised his glass in a toast, his voice strong, despite his 70 years, to the hunt, to the family, to the fatherland. She had echoed the words without question, believing absolutely in the world they represented. That had been barely 3 years ago, but it felt like a lifetime. The girl who had stood in those Bavarian forests no longer existed, replaced by someone harder, colder, more uncertain. Irmgard had joined the German Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1943, driven by a mixture of patriotism, adventure, and the desire to serve something greater than herself. November 12, 1944. The transport truck rumbled through the endless Canadian wilderness, carrying its cargo of 43 German women prisoners toward an uncertain future. Irmgard pressed her face against the cold metal side of the vehicle, trying to catch glimpses of the landscape through the small gaps in the canvas covering. What she saw was utterly alien to everything she had known. Trees stretched endlessly in every direction, not the carefully managed forests of Bavaria, but wild, untamed expanses that seemed to go on forever. The sky was a pale gray, heavy with the promise of snow, and the temperature had dropped so dramatically in the past hour that her breath now formed thick clouds even inside the covered truck. Beside her, Elfriede Müller, a former radio operator from Hamburg, sat with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, shivering despite the worn Wehrmacht blanket draped across her shoulders. "We're going to freeze to death before we even reach wherever they're taking us," Elfriede muttered in German, her teeth chattering. Irmgard said nothing, maintaining the stoic silence she had adopted since their capture 3 weeks earlier in Belgium. Speaking invited questions, questions invited thoughts, and thoughts invited the dangerous realization of just how completely their world had collapsed. The truck finally lurched to a stop after what felt like hours of bone-jarring travel. The canvas flap was pulled back, revealing a tall Canadian officer with a weathered face and eyes that seemed neither cruel nor kind, merely tired. Captain Aldrich surveyed the women with the expression of a man who had been given an assignment he neither requested nor particularly wanted. "Out," he said simply, gesturing toward the compound visible behind him. "Keep your belongings with you, single file. Sergeant Prue will show you to your barracks." The women climbed down stiffly, their limbs cramped from the journey. What greeted them was a small facility, nothing like the massive POW camps they had heard about. A handful of wooden buildings surrounded by a simple wire fence, guard towers at each corner, and beyond that, nothing but endless forest stretching toward a horizon already darkening with approaching dusk. The compound looked hastily constructed, as though it had been thrown together specifically for this unusual cargo of female prisoners. Irmgard's trained eye noted the layout, the positions of the guards, the locations of the buildings. Old habits died hard, even when military intelligence no longer served any purpose. Sergeant Prue, a compact French-Canadian with a no-nonsense demeanor, led them toward the largest barrack. His English was heavily accented, but clear. "You will sleep here. Meals are at 0600, 1200, and 1800 hours. You will maintain cleanliness of your quarters. You will follow all camp regulations. Any questions will be directed to Captain Aldrich through proper channels." Inside, the barrack was spartanly furnished with rows of metal bunks, thin mattresses, and a single wood-burning stove at the center. It was bitterly cold, despite the stove's efforts. The women filed in silently, each claiming a bunk with the same mechanical efficiency they had learned during their military service. Irmgard chose a bed near the back wall, setting down her small canvas bag containing everything she still owned in the world. One change of clothes, a tin cup, a small photograph of her family that she had somehow managed to keep hidden during processing, and a worn prayer book her mother had given her before she left Bavaria. Such meager possessions to represent an entire life. That first night, huddled under inadequate blankets, while wind howled through gaps in the barrack walls, Irmgard listened to the muffled sounds of other women crying. Some wept quietly, trying to maintain dignity even in despair. Others sobbed openly, beyond caring who heard. She herself remained dry-eyed, her jaw clenched against both cold and emotion. Crying accomplished nothing. Emotion was weakness, and weakness meant surrender. The first 3 weeks in the Canadian camp established a rhythm of silent endurance. The 43 German women moved through their days like ghosts, performing assigned tasks with mechanical precision while maintaining an invisible wall between themselves and their captors. They cleaned their barracks, stood for roll call, ate their rations in silence, and returned to their bunks each evening without speaking more than absolutely necessary. Even among themselves, conversation was minimal, conducted in whispered German during the brief moments when guards were out of earshot. It was as though speaking aloud might somehow make their situation more real, more permanent. Irmgard found herself gravitating toward a small group of women who shared her approach to captivity. Elfrida, the radio operator, possessed a sharp mind and sharper tongue that she kept carefully controlled. Brunhilde Schmidt, called Hilda by the others, had served as a logistics clerk in France and carried herself with the bearing of Prussian nobility, despite coming from a family of modest shopkeepers. Christel Wagner, barely 20 years old, had been a nursing assistant whose gentle nature seemed perpetually on the verge of breaking under the weight of their circumstances. And then there was Lorelei Adler, a former translator whose fluent English she stubbornly refused to use, treating it as a form of collaboration with the enemy. The Canadian Guards, for their part, maintained professional distance. They were neither cruel nor particularly kind, simply men doing a job they found awkward and uncomfortable. Captain Aldrich ran the camp with firm efficiency, ensuring regulations were followed but showing no interest in interaction beyond what duty required. Sergeant Prue handled daily operations with the same detached competence, his face revealing nothing of what he thought about guarding women instead of men. The regular guards rotated through shifts with clockwork precision, their young faces suggesting they would rather be anywhere else, doing anything else. Among these guards was Private Duncan Fraser, a lanky young man who looked barely old enough to shave, let alone serve in the military. He had arrived at the camp 2 weeks after the women, part of a rotation from another facility. Unlike the other guards who avoided eye contact and kept conversation to barked orders, Duncan seemed almost embarrassed by the whole situation. He walked his patrol routes with his shoulders slightly hunched, as though trying to make himself smaller, less threatening. Irmgard noticed this, but interpreted it as weakness rather than consideration. December brought snow that transformed the compound into a frozen wasteland. The thin walls of the barracks provided minimal protection against temperatures that regularly dropped well below freezing. The women wore every piece of clothing they possessed, layering their auxiliary uniforms with whatever blankets they could spare from their beds. Still, they shivered constantly, their fingers turning blue during outdoor roll calls that seemed to last forever in the bitter wind. Frostbite became a genuine concern. Nurse Constance Webb, the camp's medical officer, made daily rounds checking the women for signs of exposure. She was a middle-aged woman with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that had seen too much suffering to maintain the guards' emotional distance. When she examined the women, her touch was gentle but professional, her voice quiet as she issued instructions through Lorelei, who translated with obvious reluctance. "You need to keep moving," Nurse Webb would say. "Don't sit still for long periods. Massage your fingers and toes regularly. If you feel numbness, report it immediately." The women accepted her care with sullen silence, neither grateful nor resentful, simply enduring. Irmgard submitted to the examinations without protest, but without acknowledgement. This was survival, nothing more. The nurse represented the enemy just as surely as the guards did, regardless of her medical oath or her apparent concern. Trust was a luxury they could not afford. December 20th, 1944. The temperature had dropped to minus 23 degrees Celsius, cold enough that even the seasoned Canadian guards moved quickly between their heated stations and the patrol routes. The women's barracks, despite the perpetually burning stove, remained barely above freezing. Ice formed on the inside of the windows each night, creating intricate patterns that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. Irmgard woke one morning to find frost coating the thin blanket near her face where her breath had condensed and frozen. During the night, she sat up slowly, her muscles stiff with cold, and surveyed the barracks. Most of the women were already awake, huddled near the stove in small groups, trying to absorb whatever warmth it offered before morning roll call. Crystal looked particularly ill, her face pale and her eyes glassy with what might have been fever. Elfrida had wrapped an extra blanket around the younger woman's shoulders, her usual sharp demeanor softened by concern. "She needs to see the nurse," Elfriede said quietly in German. Irmgard nodded but said nothing. Admitting weakness to their captors felt like surrender, but letting Crystal suffer served no purpose either. That morning's roll call was mercifully brief. Even Sergeant Prue seemed eager to complete the ritual and return to warmth. As the women were dismissed back to their barracks, Private Duncan Fraser approached Captain Aldrich, speaking in a low voice that Irmgard nonetheless overheard as she passed. "Sir, permission to speak freely." The captain nodded curtly. "These women are going to start getting seriously ill if we don't do something about the cold. That barracks isn't insulated properly. We've got extra blankets in storage from the men's facility that closed last month." Captain Aldrich studied the young private with an expression Irmgard couldn't quite read. "You're concerned about enemy prisoners, Fraser?" Duncan's jaw tightened slightly. "I'm concerned about human beings freezing to death on our watch, sir." "With respect?" There was a long pause during which Irmgard pretended to adjust her coat while listening intently. Finally, the captain nodded. "Distribute the blankets. and have someone check that stove. If it's not functioning properly, get it repaired." 2 hours later, Duncan appeared at the barracks door with another guard, both of them carrying armloads of thick wool blankets. The women watched suspiciously as the Canadians entered their space. "These are for you," he said, his voice uncertain. "Extra blankets. It's going to get colder before it gets warmer." No one moved. The women simply stared at the offered blankets as though they might be some kind of trick. Duncan shifted uncomfortably, then simply began placing blankets on the nearest bunks. His companion did the same, working quickly and efficiently. When they finished, Duncan paused at the door. "Also, someone will be here this afternoon to fix your stove. It's not drawing properly." He left before anyone could respond. Elfrida was the first to move, walking over to examine one of the blankets. It was thick, well made, far superior to the thin issue blankets they had been given. "It's real," she said simply, "not a trick, just a blanket." That night, wrapped in the additional warmth, Irmgard slept more soundly than she had since her capture. January 6, 1945. Private Duncan Fraser stood in the forest 3 kilometers from the camp, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm as he scanned the winter landscape. This was his day off, a precious 48 hours away from the awkward tension of guarding women who looked at him with either suspicion or contempt. He had grown up on a farm outside Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, where hunting wasn't sport but necessity, a way to supplement the family table during lean times. His father had taught him to track in these northern forests, to read the subtle signs that separated empty wilderness from productive hunting grounds. The fresh deer tracks in the snow told him he was close. He moved quietly through the trees, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The morning sun filtered through bare branches, casting long shadows across unmarked snow. Then he saw it. A magnificent white-tailed buck, perhaps 75 meters away, pawing at the snow to reach the frozen grass beneath. Duncan raised his rifle slowly, steadied his breathing, and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the forest, and the deer dropped cleanly. He approached the fallen animal with the mixture of respect and practicality his father had instilled in him. This was meat for the winter, protein that would feed people, not a trophy to mount on a wall. He had dressed the deer and was preparing to drag it back to his truck when an idea struck him. The camp kitchens served adequate but monotonous rations to both guards and prisoners. Fresh venison would be a welcome change. More than that, something about the haunted look in those German women's eyes had been bothering him for weeks. They were the enemy, yes, but they were also just people, far from home, cold and frightened. His grandmother, who had emigrated from Scotland as a young bride, used to say that sharing food was the first step toward understanding. When Duncan returned to camp that evening with the deer loaded in the back of his truck, he went straight to Captain Aldrich's office. The captain looked up from his paperwork with mild surprise. "Fraser, thought you were off duty." "I am, sir. Was. I went hunting this morning. Got a deer. I was thinking, with your permission, we could share it with the camp, all of it, including the prisoners." Captain Aldrich leaned back in his chair, studying the young private. "That's a generous thought, Fraser. But you understand these are enemy prisoners of war. Some of the men might not appreciate sharing fresh meat with Germans." Duncan had anticipated this objection. "Sir, it's cold enough that the meat will keep for weeks. There's plenty for everyone. And those women are barely surviving in this weather. A decent meal might prevent us from having medical problems we don't have the resources to handle." Sergeant Prue, who had been standing near the filing cabinet, spoke up. "The private has a point about the medical situation. Nurse Webb has been requesting additional rations for weeks." Captain Aldrich drummed his fingers on his desk, considering. Finally, he nodded. "All right, take it to the kitchen. Tell Cook to prepare it for the entire camp. But Fraser, this doesn't change anything. They're still prisoners. We're still guards." "Understood, sir." "Thank you, sir." February 14, 1945. The mess hall had never smelled like this before. When the women filed in for their midday meal, the usual odor of boiled vegetables and institutional cooking had been replaced by something rich, earthy, and achingly familiar. Wild game, slow-cooked with root vegetables and herbs. Venison. Irmgard stopped so abruptly that Elfrida nearly walked into her from behind. The scent hit her like a physical force, transporting her instantly across an ocean and 3 years into the past. Her throat tightened, and she felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. Around her, other women were having similar reactions. Brunhilde's hand went to her chest as though steadying her heart. Crystal's eyes widened and immediately filled with tears. Even Lorelei, who prided herself on showing no weakness before their captors, stood frozen in place, her face suddenly vulnerable. Corporal Barnes stood behind the serving line with an expression of satisfied pride, ladling generous portions of dark, rich stew into metal bowls. "Real venison stew," he announced to the room at large, courtesy of Private Fraser's hunting skills. Fresh deer, slow-cooked overnight with potatoes, carrots, onions, and herbs. Enjoy. Irmgard accepted her bowl with trembling hands and sat down mechanically, the bowl steaming in front of her. For a long moment, she simply stared at it, unable to bring herself to take the first bite, because she knew, with absolute certainty, that once she tasted it, she would be back in Bavaria. She would be 17 again, sitting at her family's table, surrounded by everyone she loved, and the knowledge that she could never return to that moment, that those people and that life were gone forever, might be more than she could bear. But hunger and memory proved stronger than caution. She lifted the spoon to her lips and tasted. The flavor exploded across her tongue, and suddenly she wasn't in a Canadian prison camp anymore. She was home, November 1942, the hunting feast. Her mother's kitchen filled with warmth and laughter, and the incomparable aroma of venison prepared in the traditional Bavarian style. The long wooden table covered with her grandmother's embroidered cloth. The ceramic serving dishes that had been in the family for generations. Her father at the head of the table, his face ruddy from cold and wine, telling and retelling the story of Irmgard's successful shot. Her mother moving between kitchen and dining room, her apron dusted with flour, her smile warm with pride. Her brothers arguing good-naturedly about who would get the largest portion, her grandfather raising his glass in that toast, to the hunt, to the family, to the fatherland. The venison had been perfect that night. Tender and rich, seasoned with juniper berries her mother had gathered from the forests. She had been so certain of her place in the world that evening, so sure of who she was and what she believed. Now, sitting in this Canadian mess hall, with that same taste on her tongue, Irmgard felt tears streaming down her face for the first time since her capture. Around her, other women were crying too. The taste of home had broken through defenses that months of captivity had failed to penetrate. The venison stew changed something fundamental in the camp. The walls between captors and captives didn't collapse immediately, but they began to develop cracks that widened with each passing day. The women still maintained their distance, still spoke primarily in German among themselves, but the hard edge of hostility had softened into something more complicated. Irmgard found herself watching Private Duncan Fraser during his patrol rounds, noticing details she had previously ignored. The way he walked with his shoulders slightly hunched, as though apologizing for his presence. How he always knocked before entering the barracks, even though regulations didn't require it. The careful respect in his voice when he addressed them, never barking orders like some of the other guards. One afternoon in late February, she found herself standing near the fence during the brief recreation period, watching the forest beyond. Duncan was on duty nearby, stamping his feet against the cold. He glanced at her, then away, then back again, as though wrestling with some internal decision. Finally, he spoke. "You're from Bavaria?" His voice was hesitant, uncertain. Irmgard turned to look at him, surprised. She had learned some English in school, but had refused to use it since her capture. After a long moment, she nodded, "Yes." "Bavaria," he smiled slightly. My grandfather was from Germany, not Bavaria, somewhere in the north. He used to talk about the forests there. Said they were the most beautiful in the world. She felt something shift inside her. This wasn't interrogation or mockery. It was just conversation, simple human connection. The forests in Bavaria are very beautiful, she said carefully, testing each English word. Very old, very deep. Duncan nodded toward the wilderness surrounding the camp. These are pretty impressive, too. Different, but impressive. In Saskatchewan, where I'm from, the land is mostly flat. Farmland. I'd never seen forests like these until I joined up. Do you hunt? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Duncan's face brightened. Yeah, my dad taught me. Started when I was about 10. Deer, mostly. Some elk. It's how we got through the Depression. He paused, then added quietly, that stew a few weeks ago. That was from a deer I shot. I know. The words came out softer than she intended. It tasted like home. Their eyes met, and in that moment something unspoken passed between them. An acknowledgement that they were both far from home, both caught up in circumstances larger than themselves, both trying to find meaning in a world that had stopped making sense. Over the following weeks, these brief conversations became more frequent. Duncan would pause during his rounds to share small stories about Saskatchewan, about farming and hunting and the rhythms of rural life. Irmgard found herself responding carefully at first, then with increasing openness. She told him about the mountains visible from her village, about the way fog would settle in the valleys on autumn mornings, about traditions that stretched back centuries. They were small exchanges, nothing profound, but they represented something neither had expected to find in a prisoner of war camp: the possibility that enemies might also be human beings. April 12, 1945. The newspapers arrived at the camp the same way they always did, bundled and dropped off by the weekly supply truck. But this delivery was different. Captain Aldrich stood in his office staring at the front page of the Toronto Star, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. The headline screamed in bold type, accompanied by photographs so disturbing that he had to look away. Allied forces had liberated concentration camps in Germany. What they found defied comprehension. He made a decision that would forever alter the dynamic of his camp. He ordered the newspapers to be made available to the German prisoners. Irmgard was in the barracks when Sergeant Prue arrived carrying a stack of newspapers. His face was grim, his usual efficiency replaced by something that looked like barely controlled anger. "You need to see these," he said in English, then repeated it in halting German. "You need to know what your country did." He placed the papers on the table near the stove and left without another word. The women gathered slowly, uncertain. Lorelei, whose English was the strongest despite her previous refusal to use it, picked up the first newspaper. Her face went white as she read. She sat down heavily, the paper shaking in her hands. Elfrida leaned over her shoulder, and Irmgard watched as her friend's expression transformed from curiosity to confusion to absolute horror. "What is it?" Brunhilde asked in German. "What does it say?" Lorelei's voice was barely a whisper. "Concentration camps. They're saying we had concentration camps, places where people were." The words died in her throat. Irmgard grabbed another newspaper, forcing herself to read the English text slowly, carefully, wanting desperately to misunderstand, but the words were clear. Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau, systematic murder, gas chambers, mass graves. Photographs showed living skeletons in striped uniforms, piles of emaciated bodies, evidence of industrialized death on a scale that seemed impossible. "This cannot be real," Crystal said, her voice rising. "This is propaganda, Allied lies to make us look like monsters." But there were too many newspapers, too many photographs, too many detailed accounts from too many sources. British soldiers, American liberators, even German. Civilians from nearby towns who claimed they never knew, never suspected. Irmgard sat on her bunk, a newspaper spread across her lap, tears streaming down her face. She thought of all the rallies she had attended, all the speeches about German greatness and destiny. She remembered the pride she had felt serving the fatherland, the certainty that Germany was defending civilization against its enemies. Everything she had believed, everything she had built her identity upon, was revealed as a monstrous lie. Around her, other women were having similar revelations. Some wept, some sat in stunned silence, some angrily insisted it must be false, but their voices lacked conviction. Elfrida looked at Irmgard, her face streaked with tears. How do we live with this? How do we go home knowing what we were part of? Irmgard had no answer. The girl who had hunted deer in the Bavarian forests, who had believed in honor and duty and the righteousness of her cause, no longer existed. In her place sat someone who didn't know who she was anymore. May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war was over. In cities across Canada and America, celebrations erupted in the streets. Church bells rang, strangers embraced, and the long nightmare of global conflict seemed finally at an end. In the prison camp in northern Ontario, the atmosphere was far more subdued. Captain Aldrich called a general assembly for all prisoners at 10:00 hours. The 43 German women gathered in the mess hall, their faces reflecting the complicated emotions of the past weeks. They knew what this announcement would mean. Repatriation. Return to Germany. Return to a homeland that no longer existed in any form they recognized. Captain Aldrich stood before them, holding official documents from the War Department. His voice was steady but not unkind. Ladies, the war in Europe has concluded. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. As prisoners of war, you will be repatriated to your homeland within the next month. Transportation will be arranged through displaced persons camps in Europe, where you will be processed before being released to return to your homes. He paused, observing their faces. What he didn't expect was what happened next. Irmgard stood slowly, her hands shaking. In careful English, she addressed the captain directly. "Captain Aldrich, may I speak?" Permission granted. She looked around at the other women. "Some of us have been discussing among ourselves. We do not wish to return to Germany immediately." The words hung in the air like smoke. Several guards exchanged confused glances. Elfrida stood next, followed by Brunhilde, Lorelei, and 6 other women. They formed a small group within the larger assembly, their decision clearly made. "Captain," Elfriede said in halting English, "Germany is not our home anymore. The Germany we served, we discovered, was not the Germany we believed in." Captain Aldrich was momentarily speechless. In all his military experience, he had never encountered prisoners requesting to remain in captivity rather than accept freedom. He asked for clarification, and what followed was an outpouring of emotion that revealed the depth of transformation these women had undergone. Irmgard explained that they had written to the International Red Cross trying to locate their families. Of the 10 women who wished to stay, only 2 had received any news from home. Both had learned their families were dead, killed in Allied bombing raids. The others faced complete uncertainty about whether anyone they loved had survived. More than that, they had found something in the Canadian camp they feared losing. "Here," Irmgard continued, "we have learned what it means to be treated with dignity, even as enemies. We have seen kindness where we expected cruelty. We have been given the chance to become better people than we were." Private Duncan Fraser approached Captain Aldrich after the assembly. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "these women aren't our enemies anymore. They're just people who got caught up in something bigger than they understood. Sending them back to nothing seems wrong." That evening, Captain Aldrich sent an urgent telegram to his superiors in Ottawa describing the unprecedented situation. The response would take days to arrive, leaving everyone in a strange state of limbo, suspended between past and future, between captivity and an unknown freedom. June 20th, 1945. The final repatriation day arrived, but the scene at the camp was unlike anything in the history of Canadian prisoner of war operations. Instead of the usual tense processing of defeated enemies, the atmosphere resembled a community farewell. The 33 women who had chosen repatriation stood ready to depart, carrying letters from Canadian soldiers, photographs from their time at the camp, and a different understanding of what their former enemies represented. Captain Aldrich addressed them with words he later said were among the most difficult of his career. "You came here as our enemies," he told them, "but you leave as something we never expected, as friends." The 10 women who remained watched their companions board the transport vehicles. Tears were shed on both sides, but they were tears of hope rather than despair. Both groups were embarking on journeys toward unknown futures, but they were journeys they had chosen. For those staying, the transition from prisoners to immigrants proved challenging but rewarding. The War Department had agreed to reclassify them as displaced persons, allowing them to apply for immigration status. Local families, moved by their story, stepped forward as sponsors. The Kowalski family, Polish immigrants who understood what it meant to rebuild life in a new country, offered to sponsor Irmgard. Duncan Fraser's own family in Saskatchewan volunteered to help Elfrida. Other community members provided support for the remaining women. Irmgard found work as a translator, helping process the thousands of displaced persons arriving from war-torn Europe. Her unique perspective as someone who had been on both sides of the conflict made her invaluable in bridging cultural gaps. Elfrida completed secretarial training and eventually worked for the provincial government. The other women found their own paths, always carrying with them the lessons about human kindness, overcoming hatred. But perhaps the most remarkable development was the relationship that grew between Irmgard and Duncan. What had begun as brief conversations across a fence evolved into genuine friendship, then something deeper. In 1948, they married in a small ceremony in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. Irmgard brought her Bavarian cooking traditions to the Canadian prairies, teaching Duncan's mother the recipes her own mother had taught her. But there was one dish that held special meaning. Every winter, when Duncan returned from hunting, Irmgard would prepare venison stew using both her Bavarian recipe and the Canadian methods she had learned. It became a tradition in their household, a symbol of two cultures merging, of enemies becoming family, of how a simple meal had changed everything. 25 years after that February day when the smell of venison first cracked her defenses, Irmgard stood in her Saskatchewan kitchen, preparing the same stew for her own children. She had learned that home wasn't just where you came from, it was where you chose to build a life that honored the best in human nature. The taste of wild game would forever remind her of Bavaria, but also of the unexpected kindness that had given her a second chance. Of the Canadian who had shared his hunt, and in doing so had helped her find her way home.